Hey guys, and welcome to this new lecture about the jQuery library. This is Ionut and I'll be your voice for today. So let's dive right in. What is jQuery? Well, jQuery is a JavaScript lightweight library. When we think about library, we think about a lot of functions that are meant to help us and make our coding lives easier. The jQuery library, it is very easy to use. It has a lot of documentation out there. It is very powerful. It is cross-browser compatible, and you can download it for free, of course, from the jQuery official website. Under the download section, we can download two different versions. One of the versions is the compressed version, which is basically the minified and obfuscated version of the library. And we can also download the uncompressed version, which is the plain code behind the entire library. So whenever you're curious what happens behind scenes when you're using a particular jQuery function, you just have to come here, search for that function, and see exactly what it does. The version that we're gonna use in our examples is the compressed version, which you can download by just right-clicking on it and save link as, which will automatically prompt you to download the version of this library, which I already have. So let's see some jQuery features. Well, jQuery interacts very well with the DOM structure of the HTML page and has support for CSS manipulation. You will see next that it has CSS-like selectors. It has a very strong event handling support. You can easily add effects, transition, and animations to your web page. Of course, it has support for AJAX requests and simple data support, and it also has JavaScript utility methods. The way you can use and include this library in your page is by using the script tag within the head tag, and for the script tag you can specify the source, which source can be either a local file, a local downloaded version of the library, or you can also use the online version. The problem with the online version is that every time that you will load your page, it will have to download the version, to also load the version from this page in your page. I strongly suggest you to use the downloaded version because that's faster and it's much easier to use. Some things about jQuery. Well, basically this entire library offers us just the function, the jQuery function. And also the short version of it, which is the $sign. You've probably seen it like this in most of the places, but you can also use just jQuery like that instead of the $sign. And when you call the jQuery function like this, or not just like this, but also with CSS selector likes and so on, it will return you a jQuery object. So where is the best location to put your jQuery code? Well, you can see here in this example, we are already using the jQuery function. And what this means is that whenever the document is ready, there is a ready event which is triggered, which can be captured like this by the jQuery function, and it determines when the DOM is fully loaded. So for instance, let's say here we have this document. We select the document is our current page, and we say that when the page is ready, execute the function that we're defining here. And here within this function, you should put all your jQuery code. A short alternative for this is just jQuery of function. And that's it. You can just use this. Is the equivalent of this longer version of this. Let's talk a little bbit more about jQuery method call syntax. So methods called on jQuery selections are in the jQuery in the $.fn namespace and automatically receive and return the selection as this. For example, we have here a P tag selected. So as I mentioned before, we have CSS like selector, and when I say this, I can read this like jQuery of p.html test paragraph. So what this will do will select all p elements from my HTML page, and for each individual p element it will set this text to it. And here we have a similar CSS selector like selection here, which will select the element with ID within my div, and what will do, it will remove that element. Also, methods in the jQuery namespace are generally utility type methods and do not work with selections. So if we just say jQuery.each, will iterate through an array of objects and will execute this function for each and every object. So for instance, in this particular example, we're looping through this array and just console logging each element of the array and of course its position in the array. Methods called on jQuery selections. So we have a simple syntax. Well, when we call something like this, it will return us a jQuery object. As I mentioned before, on that object we can call different type of methods, like action methods, and to these action methods we can also pass some params to them. For example, if we have this selector here, which selects all the elements within a div, elements that have the class 1 on them, it will select all those elements and it will hide them. We also have the chain syntax, where we can use the selector to select a particular HTML element, and then we can call an action on it, and then we can call another action on it, and so on and so forth. So for example, here we can select the HTML element with the ID content. We find all the H3 elements within the element with ID content, and for all these H3 elements we're gonna set the HTML to new text for the HTML for the H3 string. Or another way that we could write this is by just having new lines after each action that we've called. Of course, there are a lot of jQuery selectors, as I said. It has CSS-like syntax for selectors. So for instance, we have jQuery of star, which selects all the elements in our page. Then we have jQuery of SOMEID, which selects just some element with ID attribute equals to SOMEID. Another example of a selector is by selecting the class, selecting by the name of the tag or the HTML element. Then we have elements with classes 1 and 2, and so on and so forth. I think some of them, I mean most of them, you should be remember them from the CSS lecture. Let's see here. of course, we can use comma to separate multiple selectors. So for instance, this will select all h1, h2, or h3 elements. We have the first child, which selects div elements that are the first child of their parents. And what do we have here? We also have the ability to select elements, all p elements, which are direct childs of div elements. About jQuery events, so it has support for most HTML elements. For instance, mouse events, you can define what should happen when you click, when you double click, when you focus, when you're focusing, when you're focus out, on blur, on hover, mouse down, mouse enter, and so on and so forth on a particular element in your page. Then we have keyboard events. We can determine whether a key was pressed, when a key was up, when a key was down. Of course, key press means key up, key down. What else? We have form events. We can capture when the form is getting submitted or when it's getting changed. And we have window events. Some of the window events are, for instance, the load, resize. So when we resize the browser, we also have the ready function, which we already know. We have scroll and unload. The way we can bind events to handling functions. So basically, we have the event and we have to tell to our code what should happen when that event occurs. So for instance, we have this way of binding a handling function to our event. So we have the selector, which this can be each element in our page, the event name dot event name, and the function what should happen when the event is triggered. For example, when we double click on all the divs from our page, what we should do, we should hide them. Then another way to bind events is by just using the function, the bind function, where the first argument it receives is actually a string which defines the event that we're trying to bind to it. And of course, the second attribute is the function that should get executed when this event is triggered. So, for instance, we're selecting here all list items, elements from our page. We bind the click event, and here we're saying that whenever we click on the list items, we will just console log this message: list item was clicked. There are ways to remove event handlers from selected elements, which is this unbind function. Another way to add events, to bind events to our elements in the page, is by using the on function. This is pretty similar to the bind function, but this can also take as input multiple events here separated by space, and define just one function which should and will be executed when these elements will occur. So for instance, we can say just one event here, the click event on the p elements. It will just change the CSS background color to red for all the p elements that were selected. Alright, then we have the off event, which will unbind basically this event from our HTML element. And then we also have the one function, which also receives, as the previous functions, receives the event and the function. The difference is that this one function will run the event only once. So if we have a button, for example, and we're selecting here a button, and we're saying one, and the event, if the event is click, when we click just the first time on that button, it will execute this function. And that's it. Alright, so the jQuery event object. So you could if you see here, for instance, we have in this example we have jQuery form on submit. We're defining what should happen on submit. To this function, that is basically the handler function for when the form is submitted, we can also pass to it an event object. Basically, it's just an argument. It doesn't have to be named like this. It's just an argument that this function can receive, which is basically the event that was triggered. And what we could do is we could prevent default, for instance, right? So when the form is submitted, we can prevent default, so it is not submitted, right? So this event object is passed to the event handling function along with the selected element. Some of the properties of this event object are page X, page Y, which represents the mouse position at the time when the event happened. Then we have the type of the event object. We have some data that can be passed to the handling function when event is bound. And then we have the target, which is the DOM element that initiated the event. jQuery and CSS. So jQuery doesn't allow us just to select different elements and that's it, and call some functions. We can also manipulate we can also manipulate the CSS of those elements. So for instance, getting CSS properties, we can just select a p element from our page, and using the CSS function with a string as argument, where the string represents the CSS property that we're trying to get the value for, we can just use it like this. Or we can also use the CSS function to set different kind of values to different kind of CSS properties. For example, let's say here we're selecting the p element, and what we're trying to do here is to set the CSS, the font size, to this p element to 14 pixels. Or we could also define multiple CSS properties in here if we're just using as argument an object for this function. So in this object, the key is the property, the CSS property that we're trying to define, and the value is basically the value of the property. So here we're defining the red color for all the p elements. We're defining the width to 100% and the height to 100%. We can also add, remove, and toggle CSS classes. So for instance, if we have this CSS class over here, and in our JavaScript code, we write something like jQuery div with ID 1 add class fancy, it will automatically add the fancy class on the div 1 on the HTML element that has div 1 as input. We can also remove the fancy class, or we can also just toggle the class. This will just add remove, add remove, add remove over and over. All right, now let's talk a little bit about jQuery effects hide show. So we have pretty straightforward hide, show, and toggle for just hide and showing different kind of HTML elements that we're selecting from our page. So for instance, here for hide, we have as first argument the speed of the hide action, then the callback function, which is called after the effect is done. Then we have show function, which has similar arguments, the speed of the action and also a callback function. And of course we have toggle, which will toggle between hide and show. An example, for instance, would be, let's say we have a button in our page. We're selecting the tag, the HTML button element here, and we're defining what should happen on click. So on click, we're gonna select all P elements and we're gonna hide them, and the transition should take like 20 milliseconds. Then here we're selecting the IDs within P and we're showing it with slow speed. Another example would be here with the toggle function, where when we click on a button, we just toggle on and off. So we're showing and hiding all P elements. Other jQuery effects like fading. So we can have fade in, fade out, and of course fade toggle. These are similar with the show hide events, which are and have as arguments the speed and the callback function, which is called after the effect is done. You can see here also an example for this. We also have sliding effects, so we can just slide up something, some element events, just by calling the slide up function, or we could just slide down some HTML elements just by calling the slide down function. Of course, as pretty similar as the ones before, they have a speed as argument and call back a function which is called after the effect is done. All right, another type of events are animations. By the way, we're gonna see most of these in action at the end of the slides. We're gonna go through some examples. So we can define different animations for our jQuery elements by using the animate function, which receives, this is slightly different than the ones before. It receives an object with parameters. These parameters are basically CSS properties and values that define the animation for our element. Of course, we have the speed and the callback, where the speed is slow, fast, or milliseconds, or and the callback is a function called after the effect is done. So for instance, if we want to define an animation for our div with ID div1, and this animation should occur when I click on a button in my page, I can just select my div and call the animate function, and to this animate function I can provide different CSS properties. For instance, here I'm defining left 100 pixels and top 100 pixels, and what this will do, this will animate and move my div with ID div1 from its original position to the position defined by these two CSS properties, which is left 100 pixel and top 75 pixels. Of course, we can have here multiple CSS properties. For example, like here, if we want to define a more complex animation, we can also, let's say we're moving on the y-axis to 5 pixels, this div1. We're also changing opacity to 0.3. We're changing the height of our div to 100 pixels and the width of our div to 100 pixels. And this is a very easy way to define an animation. Whereas, remember, in CSS we had to use those keyframes to define our animation, and then we had to use the transitions to start the animation. So this is way much easier to use and define animations like this. Getting and setting HTML content. So of course what we're doing in our page, we're basically setting text, we're getting text, we're setting other HTML elements and so on. So for instance, the text function sets or returns the text content of selected elements. It's basically, think of it like if you're using it without any arguments, it plays the role of a getter, and if you're using the text function with arguments in here, it is playing the role of a setter function. So for instance, here we're selecting all p elements, and using the text function we're just console logging the text within all the p elements. Whereas here we're selecting the p element and using the text function, now this time with some value here, this will set this value to the p elements selected here. We also have the HTML function, which is pretty similar to the text function, which sets or returns the content of selected elements, including the HTML markup. So again, similarly to this one, if you're using it without any argument in here, it will play the role of a getter, and if you're using it with arguments, it will play the role of a setter. So for instance, here we're selecting all the elements and we're just listing all the HTML content of those elements, and here we're selecting the div elements and using the HTML function with arguments, which is a string that represents a p tag with test in it, right? So this will set the HTML to my div to this, what I'm passing here as value. All right. This is for text and HTML. Of course, we also have form fields. Form fields can have values. So if I want to get the value of a particular form field. So for instance, input is a form field. Here, if I want to get the value of that input, I will not say .html or text, I will say .value. And if I want to set a value to that input HTML element, I will call this value with arguments in here. Of course, we also have attributes on our HTML elements. We can set or get those attributes using the attr function. So for instance here, if we want to see what's the href of a particular a element, we just have to say .attr href. Or if we want to set the href to an a element, we can just call it with two arguments, where the first argument is the attribute that we want to set, and the second one is the value that we want to set to our HTML element. Of course, we can also remove HTML content to our HTML elements. So instead of just calling the text with arguments, which will basically replace, so this will replace whatever the p tag had before, will replace with what I'm passing it here, but maybe sometimes I just want to append or prepend. So for this, we have special functions which does just what I said. So it appends text to the p elements, it prepends text to the p elements. If we're talking about the HTML function and we want to set add before prepend or append different HTML code to these elements, we can use after and before to do that. So append will append some text, and after will basically add some HTML content to my p element, or before to do it before. Of course, I'm able to remove everything within an element, and I can also empty it if I'm using the empty function. Alright, so that's it with the slides. Now let's dive right into some examples and see this library in action. Alright, so here we have several examples. We're gonna go on each and every one and try to see what's going on here. Okay, so let's start with the first example over here. First, let's see it in action. Alright, so it says here, if you click me, I will disappear. Oh, will you? Oh, there you go. Let me refresh and bring you back. Click again. There you go. Cool. So let's see how we did that. So first of all, you can see here in the head tag, in the head section of my page, I'm using the script tag to first include the version of the file which contains the jQuery library. This is the jQuery library that I've downloaded on my computer, just so that it's easier to use and it's not getting load each and every time I'm opening this page. And when I'm say opening this page, I'm referring to whenever I just hit refresh over and over and over and over again, right? Let's take, for example, Let's see this. Let's do this. So let's see, copy link and just include the link here instead. Okay, now let's see what happens. Let's open up the developer tools here and let's go to the network tab. And let me just do that. All right, and let me refresh this page. Do you see how this is being downloaded from the official website? So if I'm hitting refresh again, this will be loaded again from their site. See, it goes to code.jquery.com. Whereas if I'm just leaving it like it is, you will see that it is just loading it from my local machine. So we're not downloading it every time from the official website, we're just downloading it from my local machine. All right, so let's see how we did that. So we have here in the body section, we have a P element with some text in it. And in my script tags here, I'm using the longer version for determining whether the document was loaded or not. The longer version meaning this version. I could have used as well the short version of this, which is just like that. So if I just refresh now the page, it still works. See, it still works. It's the shorter version of it. I will leave it like this, and what I do here is I'm selecting the P elements, and when I click on them, I'm just hiding them. Here, this refers to the P element, and I'm just hiding it. So if I have like multiple P elements in my page, if I click on them, they will disappear, right? Cool. If I remove, I can say when I click each P element, if I do this, what do you think it will do? I'll leave you 1 second. It will disappear all my P's, right? Because here I'm defining, here I'm selecting all the P elements and I'm calling hide function on them. All right. Oh, and of course, what I could do is, remember at the beginning of the lecture, I said that jQuery offers a function and the $sign is just a shortcut for the jQuery function. I might as well just use the jQuery function like a full name right here. Let's see what happens. See, it works. So it doesn't matter, I can use this function whatever I want instead of the $sign. I can go with just jQuery and it still works. All right, the dollar shortcut is just a shortcut. All right, so enough with this example. By the way, you will find these examples on forests page. So yes, dot forest WP. So you will find all those examples right over here, right? So here's this example. I prefer to have it on my local machine just to be able to make changes to it and explain them to you. Alright, so let's move to the second example. So in this example, let's first see it in action. So we have here like two buttons. If we click those buttons, they will interchange their position. And if I click again, nothing happens. Alright, let's see how we did that. We've used Bootstrap for just defining just for these two classes, just button primary. And also we defined here some extra CSS for our buttons here. We defined a width, a position, a top, a width, a position, and the top for the second button. And we also have here a div which has a height of 200 pixels. Basically, it's the div that defines the height, the distance between these two buttons. Cool, let's see what we did here. So in the document ready function, we defined what should happen uh, on when clicking on our buttons. By the way, a small parenthesis, let's say that we don't put this in here, but we put it in here. Do you think it will work? Well, I can tell you it depends. It depends whether or not the DOM is loaded fast enough before this code gets executed. So if I'm opening the console here in the developer tools and I click refresh, sometimes I might get, for instance here, I might get an error when clicking the buttons, or it doesn't happen anything. And it doesn't happen anything because this button that I'm trying to select here, so here I'm selecting the button, all the button elements, and try to bind them to the click event and define what should happen when you click on that button. The problem is that this function, this piece of code, got executed before the DOM was loaded. So when this piece of code got executed, the elements, the button elements in my HTML document were not loaded, so there were no elements. So that's why it's good to do this within the document ready. If you want to bind events, you should always do it within the document ready function. If you just want to let's say you just want to iterate through an array, right? Iterate through an array. You can do it here, of course, no problem. You could also, let's say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and this also has a function so what this will do, see, it worked, and this also works. So if I don't want to do anything related to my DOM elements, I can do it outside of the document ready function. But if I want to do use jQuery to manipulate my DOM elements, then I must do that within the document ready function. All right, so closing the parentheses. So let's continue with this example. So what this does, as I said, it selects the button elements and binds the click event to them. And when I click on them, I will, for the first button, I will call the animate function and I will change the top of it to 200 and I will set the action to slow. And for the second button, I'm gonna animate the top. I'm gonna animate it and move it to top to 0 pixel, of course, with action slow. So that's why when I click here, let me refresh, they interchange their position. Now you can see that if I'm continue to click on them, doesn't happen anything. So let's say I want to do something like whenever I click this, they keep interchanging their positions. So how would I do that? So let's take, for example, a variable interchanged, and this will be false initially. And here, if let's say interchanged, then I could do something like this, else I could do something else. So initially I said it's false. This means that they were never interchanged and they will change this position, which is good. And then here I will say interchanged equals not interchanged. And when I get in here again, I will just say here 2020 and like this. All right, and of course interchange. Okay, well, I can just move this outside of the if statement. All right, let's see what happens. All right, 1, 2, 3. All right, so now these two keep interchange their positions. All right. If you have any questions regarding these examples, you can ask me at the lab. All right, so the next example, which is example 3. Let's see first, what do we have here? So if you click me, I will not disappear. Let's try to do that. Yeah, it is not disappearing, believe me. And if you click me, I will disappear. Also with the background change. Nice, let's do that again. Nice, and again. Very nice. Now let's see how we've accomplished that. So let's take a look first at the HTML part of the example. We have here a p element with a particular text in it, and then we have another p element which has the class voodoo on it, and it has a style position absolute, and of course some text to this p. If you click me, I will disappear. Alright, now let's see what happens in JavaScript using the jQuery library. So what I'm doing here, I'm saying whenever I click, alright, let's do this. And let's change a little bit the functions that we're using to bind elements. And let's say when on click on the P element that has a voodoo class. What this will do on click will fade out this representing the selected element from here. This will fade out in 200 milliseconds, and it will also set the background color to it to that greenish type of color, and we animate this to top to 200 pixels slow. Now let's see what happens. It just fades away. Alright, so this is it with this example, and then we have example 4. Let's see this in action first. Okay, so let's see what happens when I click this button. Okay, seems like this text slides up. Alright, now let's see how we did that. The HTML document basically contains a button, contains a paragraph, then contains another paragraph with ID 1, and another div with ID div 1. So in jQuery, what happens is that whenever I click on the button, I just select the div with ID 1 and slide it up in 200 milliseconds. Pretty straightforward, right? All right. Okay. Let's see what happens if I comment this out and uncomment these two lines. All right, so what happens is I select all p tags and hide them, and then I will select the p with ID 1 and show it slow. See, because initially both these two paragraphs are hidden and just the paragraph 1 is displayed afterwards with slow. So when I click, this gets in here in this selector and it hides it, and then I'm showing just the one with ID 1. Alright, so that's just another example of what we can accomplish using the jQuery library. Of course, as I mentioned before, all of these examples you will find them on Forest's page. Please continue to follow Forest's page and try to follow the announcements section. Here he will post all new things that you guys will need to know regarding the web programming course. All right. Thank you very much. Have a nice day and stay inside, stay safe. Bye bye.